Okay, during Gray's time, that is in the typical pre-romantic period, we can find that there are personalities who are gradually engaged in the activities of writing commemorative verses, and not only commemorative verses, it was the verses of flattery. Somehow, with the help of these verses, the people were flattering people. So somehow the typical form of expression that it points out that they're they always to flatter others, okay, that the persons of power, the persons of interest, the important personalities of political power and maybe the social power, they always tried to keep some truths hidden from the general eye. So somehow, whenever we think about the poets who are engaged in such kind of writing the commemorative verses or maybe the flattering verses, they always evaded from expressing the truth. So here in section number 18, that is stanza number 18, Gray is trying to project this particular thing. That means if these personalities were becoming some poets, some important poets, then might be they were compelled to write some poems with the help of which they had to flatter others, okay, and somehow to express something that they didn't want to express. Here it says the struggling pangs of conscious truths to hide. What is conscious truth? The truth is actually referring to the originality. But somehow when these poets, these persons, that's why it's referring to the poets, that's because you will find that the kindle, that the muse's flame, that is writing poetry, the reference to my muse actually being pointed out that. So the struggling pangs of, that is pains, of conscious truth to hide. That means consciously they were hiding some truth from the general eye because they couldn't write anything that is truthful, okay, and express them to be read by the people in general. Suppose you have a patron, suppose you have a persons like Charles II, suppose you have the persons like James II, or maybe the persons like some important character of the typical 18th century England, and whenever you were writing your poetry, you cannot write the negative aspects of these personalities in detail, in direct form. That's why it says the struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide, to quench the blushes of ingenuous shame. That means forbid them. Actually, here also, that is in stanza number 18, you can find their Lord forbid. This particular phrase is being working. It says their Lord forbid the struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide. Their Lord forbid to quench the blushes of ingenuous shame. That means forbid them to suppress the sign of shame. Their Lord forbid the heap of the shrine of luxury and pride with incense kindled at the muse's flame. That means never tried to flatter with pleasure through writing poetry. So somehow, by not becoming the character like Milton, by not becoming the character like a great poet, a great orator, a great politician, they actually got the liberty of thinking at their own, they got the liberty of living at their own. And that's why the line actually signifies that their humble Lord spared them the sharp mental pain of hiding something which one knows to be the truth. But actually they're saying the opposite, right? And forbid them to suppress the signs of shame which one honestly feels. They never tried to flatter men of pomp, pleasure, and pride by writing poetry of praise and flattery. This was particularly true of the age of patronage Gray actually lived in. And then in the next stanza, that is stanza number 19, it says, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Very famous line, you see. So far from the madding crowd. This is a very famous phrase, this is a very famous line. Why? Because actually, From this particular line, Thomas Hardy had taken his title for a novel, Far from the Madding Crowd. It's a novel by Thomas Hardy. Here it says, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife. What is ignoble strife? Strife means any kind of conflict. Strife means a kind of competition. And ignoble strife, this actually referred to the mean competitions. So there are multiple levels of competition that is going on. And here it says, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes, the sober personalities are somehow being pointed out by these persons. That means the persons who are being referred here. So their sober wishes never learn to stray. What is stray? So move away from the path of virtue. Straying from the path of virtue. So it is their sober wishes, it is their fundamental positive sides or positive aspects within these characters that actually kept them on the right way. Okay? Because they are the virtuous personalities. Because they were the virtuous men. So that's why it says, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learn to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life. Sequestered. This very term sequestered actually referred to as secluded. You know what is secluded? That means it is the typical term that also Wordsworth used in Tintern Abbey. The life of seclusion. It is the secluded life. That's why it is being pointed out that the secluded or sequestered, it signifies where you are completely free from material affectations, where you are completely free from the earthly political affectations, right? So somehow that is the fundamental thing that it points out, that is far from the madding crowd. The people are mad, the people are insane, who are just hungry after their power, hungry after wealth, hungry after everything that they consider to be important there. So far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learn to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor. Here tenor means course, way of life. So they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. So somehow they were completely different. They were not the power-hungry personalities. They were not the typical personalities who were completely engaged in earthly enterprises. They were not after power. They were not after wealth. They were not after omnipotence and authority. So that's why they always kept a life of seclusion. They always kept a life of, spiritualism. It is a spiritual form that it takes in consideration. Yet, even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh. With uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculptured deck, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. That means it might be possible that after the death of these personalities, there were not being mentioned some high commemoratory verses. It is not In Memoriam by Tennyson. It is not maybe the Lycidas by Milton. Rather, in this particular place, that means in the country churchyard, at the cemetery where the dead bodies are being buried, or the corpses being buried, there also you can find that over the tombstone or on the tombstone there are some one or two lines, and these were written by some infamous writers. And that's why it says uncouth rhymes. Uncouth, it is not decorative verses, you see. It's not the high-flown verses of the eminent or famous poets. Rather, these were written by some semi-illiterate personalities who have the foreknowledge of who had the knowledge of some lines or so, something. So that's why it says that yet even these bones, it's bones actually referring to the skeleton or maybe the persons who are lying there. So yet even these bones from insult to protect. What is the insult? Why the insult, this term is being incorporated here or mentioned here? Here insult is actually referring to if somebody forgets him completely, it becomes an insult because they had the potentialities, they had the power, they had the capabilities. So somehow when these persons are dead, if you forget them altogether, if you completely, being completely driven in the world of lide, that is forgetfulness, it's an insult to them. So that's why it says that yet even these bones from insult to protect, that means we need to protect them, or the people have been protected them from such kind of insults, some kind of forgetfulness. So yet even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh. Memorial verses, some lines being mentioned here. Some frail though, that means they didn't have the capability of becoming such powerful memorial verses or commemoratory verses. So that's why they are frail. Still erected nigh means near. That means erected, it means actually written, or maybe the decorated. With uncouth rhymes. The uncouth, this very term was used by Milton in his Lycidas. Okay, because uncouth is actually referring to the villagers, the persons without any proper discrimination, the persons without any proper recognition. Okay, so here it says, with uncouth rhyme and shapeless sculpture decked. It is not the high formation of the sculptures. Okay, it is not a typical sculptor that have been shaping the busts, you see. Okay, so with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, so decorated with awkward figures and clumsy verses, with incorrect spelling probably, and it implores the passing tribute of a sigh. Here sigh is referring to something related to the elegies, something related to the loss, the pain, the suffering that one could feel. So that's why the sigh is there, the sordidness is there, some sadness is there, but ultimately you cannot find the typical high-flown commemoratory verses. You cannot find the typically cult, the typical high-flown sculptures or typical well-built sculptures being conceptualized. So somehow Gray is here referring to the possibilities of recognition, the possibilities of commemoration. Okay, so that's why it says that yet even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh, with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. That means here on the tombstone there are some lines being written with improper spellings. Okay, and there may be some sculptures. It might be possible that it's not a typically decorated sculpture, or rather some awkward figures have been structured there, and these were there just to remember them. Their name, their years, spelled by the unlettered muse. Here unlettered muse is actually referring to the illiterate poet or semi-illiterate poet. The place of fame and elegy supply. Okay, it is substituting epitaphs. Generally in the Westminster Abbey, if you take a look at the Westminster Abbey, the famous burials or famous graves of the famous poets, then somehow you will find the epitaphs have been structured there. So their name, their years, spelled by the unlettered muse, the place of fame and elegy supply, and many a holy text around she strews. Okay, here she is referring to the muse because it is pointing towards the structuration of the poetry. It is referring to the muse, and that's why the term she. The holy text is the biblical verses. That on the tombstone some biblical verses is being written or is being inscribed. So that teach the rustic moralist to die. Here, rustic moralist is referring to the villagers or the virtuous villagers who are facing death heroically, right? So that's why these are the things that have been taken into consideration. These are the things that have been erected on the tombstone of these personalities. It might not be the high-flown memorial verses. It might not be some carefully sculptured, or decorated statues. Rather, some clumsy figures have been incorporated. Some lines from the semi-illiterate poets have been ascribed on the tombstone. So these are the things that is actually referring to their names and years, okay, and the spellings that have been pointed by them, and somehow some holy texts, that is some biblical verses Okay, it might be possible that without the proper spelling is being incorporated, that is being pointed there, and teach the rustic moral is to die. That means the villagers, the virtuous villagers are facing death heroically. That is the fundamental thing. That is up to 21. So there are 11 more stanzas to discuss, and today up to this, and in the in our next class we will discuss about the 11 remaining stanzas. Thank you.